Yeah, good to see you too, Penguin. How's it going? Good to be here.
It's going pretty good. You've got an interesting robotic voice for me. How about you, Bogey? Do you hear it when he's
Yeah,
talking?
it sounds like I'm hearing him twice at the same time.
It does. You might
But
be.
it's kind of
Yeah,
cool and futuristic. I'm enjoying it, so thank you.
Go ahead. Try again.
is that better now?
Yes, yes. That's
Yes.
much better. Great. So today you're gonna be talking about anti-capture organizations. Is that right? Oh,
Hmm. I seem to be having some trouble. It cuts out occasionally. Can you guys hear me
Yeah,
at
we
this
can
yes.
hear
point?
you.
I
Yep.
can hear
You
you
can
and
hear
I can
me?
see you.
Okay. Can you see me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Oh,
Mhm.
interesting. My screen where it just says me and it's black. So
Oh,
I will. That's all right. I guess that's fine. Yeah, talking about anti-capture organizations. What the hell are DAOs actually? That kind of stuff.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, you'll have 30 minutes to introduce it. I'm gonna turn the floor over to you. And so yeah, your time starts now. Thank you, Spencer.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Okay. Um, so, anti-capture. I have kind of written about this before and talked about it and referenced it, and but I think every time I get to talk about it again, I figure out something new, and there's always like something like some little nuance that I hadn't thought about, or somebody asks a really intelligent question. So I'm always excited to talk about it more. It always kind of pushes some of the ideas forward. Um, so I have some slides here that we can walk through, and we can start, I guess, with just a little bit of context. So I'm Spencer. I've been working in DAOs basically full time for nearly 2 years, just about 20, maybe 22 months. The majority of my time I spend currently on DAO House, but I've previously have spent a lot of time within Raid Guild, and then more recently have started working on a side project called Hats Protocol. Um, so doing like basically all my attention is focused on DAOs. And about a year ago, I think as we all recognize, there was this huge explosion of energy around DAOs, new DAO tooling, etc. And all of that kind of opened my eyes to lots of different types of DAOs. And trying to, I started asking myself the question, like, what are DAOs actually? Can we get to some understanding of what DAOs are that is more sophisticated than like a group chat with a bank account or some other sort of like superficial descriptions or definitions. So that's kind of where this journey of that resulted in anti-capture started. Um, and I can talk about this a little bit in retrospect as something that was like a formal process. It was not at all a formal process. Um, that said, I did kind of like certain goals and values did kind of evolve or sort of emerge out of whatever backwards informal process I was taking. Um, and really what I have been trying to do is create a foundation on which to build knowledge and practices relating to uh, capture resistance and capture resistant governance, decentralized communities, Web3, DAOs, power dynamics, everything related to that. Create a shared language for describing and discussing and debating all of those things, and then hopefully fostering a community of anti-capture related research and practice that models some of the principles that we're talking about here. And then also work with other projects related to this area. Um, and ended up having like a few key values. One of them I'll talk about is the value of being non-prescriptive. Some earlier versions of this ended up being way too prescriptive. Like it seemed from, if you were just sort of reading some of the ideas, that uh, it was very much telling people how to create a DAO, and that was very much not the intention. So I took a step back and tried to take a much more first principles approach. So that's kind of the context about what you'll see throughout, hopefully. And if you don't think I'm taking a first principles approach, or you don't think that or you think that something here is too prescriptive, then please call me on it, and we'll improve it together. Okay, so backing up a little bit, one of the big things that I realized, like one of the, not epiphany moments, but a moment of insight for me, was realizing that it really all comes down to resources. So why do organizations exist? Like, why do we have these groups of people that have sort of like thrown their money together to do stuff? And it kind of comes down to sort of Coase theory of the firm type things, but also because uh, there are increasing returns to pooling our resources together. The more resources, in some sense, that we can pool together, the more of our money that we can put into one pot, the more powerful that money will be in the service of advancing the goals that we have together. However, on the other side, there are increasing costs. The more money we put together, the more people we bring together, the higher the cost to coordinate around those pooled resources and how we actually deploy them and use them and manage them. And this, in the world of atoms, so like everything before blockchains and smart contracts, there's this hard choice between what I'm kind of calling a like one of M security nightmare, where we could, so let's say we have 50 people and everybody, but maybe it's 50 investors, maybe it's 50 people putting their money in to do something together, but there's like money in a pot. We could give every single person access to all of that money. That is a security nightmare. It just takes one person to be dishonest and the money is gone. Or in the world of atoms, we can construct some kind of hierarchy where we place 1, 2, maybe 3 highly trusted people at the top of the hierarchy who really have full control over all of the resources. And then we allow them to delegate control over some small portions of those resources to some individuals. That creates the type of hierarchical, highly concentrated power organizations with high trust requirements that we have today. We can kind of improve it with a legal system that sort of is a backstop and creates some basic rules, but fundamentally, that's why we have the types of organizations that we have today that are so harmful in a lot of ways that we recognize. But now we have different tools. Now we have smart contracts built on blockchains, and we can cryptographically distribute power and break ourselves out of this one of M security nightmare. So now we can have more of a, I should have said one of N. We can have a M of N security situation, which is roughly a multi-sig, and many other different variants of that. And this is a big area that the DAO space has been exploring. So this is a fundamental change, and I think this is what underscores so much of the promise of this space. And I wanted to make sure that, like, part of what I was trying to do within Anticapture and part of what Anticapture does, at least the framework, is try to better understand what that shift is and why it's so powerful from first principles. So back to our one of N security nightmare. That is like, that's a nightmare because any one of those people can capture the resources. They can divert the resources to themselves for their own private benefit. That also happens in our like top-down hierarchical power structure organization scenario. We see this all the time in modern society. Executives like take the company jet on personal vacations. Politicians sell access and influence to corporations, and basically they sell the right to write laws. This is a classic example of capture. Do Kwon siphons off $80 million a month from Luna, and nobody can do anything about it. Nobody even knew about it until recently. Tons and tons of examples of that where we have concentrated power. But now we have the tools, like I was saying, we have the tools to create governance structures, governance that is resistant to capture, where we can prevent, maybe not perfectly, maybe not 100%, but much more effectively prevent capture of those shared resources by individuals, by private interests. So that's what the anti-capture framework is all about. It's an attempt to understand governance and coordination from first principles. And those first principles, the ones that I've kind of come to, there's 4 of them. So the first is networks. And we'll get into more details about all of these. The second is agents, so members of those networks, or persons, you can call them also. Third is resources. and fourth is actions. And within a single action, there are 4 phases that we'll get into, and that's really the meat of this framework is better understanding how networks take actions over shared resources. Okay, so this is just a quick visualization of a network. We have some kind of boundary of that network, some kind of definition of what is included and what is not included in the network. Within the network, we have individual agents or persons as nodes in the network. And then in this example, the network has some shared resources. Not all networks have shared resources, but this network does. Second property or second component of the anti-capture framework is resources. There's 3 columns here. The primary thing to focus on is actually the distinction between just 2. So shared resources and private resources. When we say private here, what we mean is not like private as in privacy, but private in the sense that I as an individual am the sole person that controls these resources. So attention, time, my own energy, those are things that only I can ever spend or control. My attention or my time can be incentivized in certain ways by others. It can be influenced. It could even be coerced in a like the worst case scenario. But nonetheless, it's still my time and my attention that I am spending. On the other side of the spectrum are types of resources that only ever exist in a distributed fashion or a shared fashion. The public Ethereum state, I think, is one of the most interesting examples of this. I can't, as an individual, I cannot own even a piece of that. I can't control even a piece of the public Ethereum state. That state allows me to own a thing, some item that is part of the state, but I don't own the state itself in any kind of way. It only exists because it exists between us. We all control it by our behaviors and actions within the Ethereum ecosystem. There's also some other kinds of resources that can either be shared or private in depending on the scenario. And these are the ones that are really at the highest risk of capture. So money, currency, NFTs, most of the things we consider as property, those can be shared or private. If they're shared, they're at risk sometimes of being captured by private actors and turned into private. Okay, so the fourth concept here is our actions. So actions are broken into 4 phases. So before we get into this, I just want to make sure that it's clear that when we're describing these phases and talking about actions, this is not meant to be prescriptive. This is not meant to be a recipe for DAOs to follow. This is meant more as a descriptive observation of one way to understand how actions take place. So I'm not necessarily recommending that you go out and create a DAO that has explicitly these phases associated with the actions that DAO takes. Maybe that might be a good idea, but I'm not making any kind of claims or even any suggestions along those lines. So with that out of the way, actions within the anti-capture framework have 4 phases. So the first phase is propose, and we'll get into more of these in detail. The second is decide on some, like which action to take. The third is executing the selected action from the decide phase. And the fourth is evaluation. So how did it go? What happened? Sort of some analysis or retrospective on the action that was executed. These are, as you can see in this image, these phases are cyclical. So the result of an evaluate phase typically leads into the proposal of some new action to take, or maybe multiple new actions to consider. You could also consider the evaluate phase as the first one. It doesn't really matter. I'm talking about propose here as the first phase, but that's a pretty arbitrary decision. You'll also notice, if you can see, that each of the phases in the rectangles here have 4 other rectangles inside of them. And that is meant to denote that these actions are actually recursive. This is one of the key properties of the anti-capture framework. It's fairly nuanced, and it might take a lot of time to really grok properly. So I'm actually not going to delve into it too much. There's a lot of meat here. We could do like an hour-long discussion or 2-hour-long talk about just the implications of that, I think. But for now, I think it's helpful to recognize that what I mean by when I say recursive. So inside of a single phase are all the other phases as well. So here's an example. So there might be a DAO that has a proposal up for voting. So voting in the DAO might be decide or execute phase, depending, and we'll get into that more. But let's say it's the execute phase. So I'm voting on a DAO execution proposal, and I'm actually deciding whether to vote yes or no. So at the time that I'm doing that, I'm in the decide phase. Previously, I was in my own propose phase where I even surfaced the possibility of voting yes and surfaced the possibility of voting no. That's all happening inside my head in or amongst my neurons. And so my neurons are roughly going through all of these phases, proposing yes or no, deciding whether to say yes or no, and then actually clicking the button that signs the transaction that says yes. And then maybe later I evaluate whether, well, did the transaction go through? Did I do something incorrect, et cetera, et cetera. So inside of the DAO's phases are my own internal action phases. And we can get much more fractal about it too in any direction. Okay, so let's dig into what I'm calling the first phase. So this is the propose phase. And in each of these phases, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what they are, and then we're going to get a feel for where or whether this phase is a place where capture can happen, and maybe how we might be able to avoid capture of things that happen during this phase. So in the propose phase, what we're doing is we are putting the options on the table. So yes or no, A, B, C, or D. Action A, action B, action C, action D. Option 1, option 2. There is an execution component to proposal. So in a lot of systems, in a lot of action systems, in a lot of DAOs, in a lot of organizations, even in your own brain, the only action you can ever take is the one that is proposed in the first place, right? You can't take an action that is not even on the table to be taken in the first place. So the propose phase often sets the agenda, and setting the agenda has quite a lot of power associated with it. And so there is an execution component to that. I want to come back to that we'll see why execution is so important. But this is an example of the recursiveness. So there's execution component of the propose phase. And so there's quite a lot of capture risk associated with the power to set the agenda. So when we're thinking about designing DAOs, we need to be very careful about not putting that the ability to propose a new action, to make a proposal, in the hands of a few. Ideally, it's in the hands of everybody who's involved in the DAO, and maybe even in the hands of people who are not involved in the DAO in other ways. There's a lot more richness inside of the propose phase, but I'm going to move ahead in the interest of time. So phase number 2 is the decide phase. So this is where we have the options on the table, we have our agenda, and now we're selecting the one that we're going to act upon. It's really, really important. Probably one of the biggest things that I learned from thinking about all of this stuff and working with these concepts is that one of the coolest things that DAOs do is they unbundle decision making from executive power. So that's why these are 2 separate phases. Deciding is different than executing. So we have selected the option that we're going to act on. The execute phase is when we're actually acting on it. So one example of this split is snapshot multisig. Snapshot, the token holders who are voting on a snapshot proposal, they decide. But ultimately, it's the multi-sig signers that take the action, that execute the action. And you can guess where most of the power is in between those two. So there's actually not a ton of power in the decide phase. There's quite a lot of influential power that can be wielded in the decide phase, especially if access to information is highly concentrated or not widely distributed or not transparent. And so there is definitely an attack vector, a capture vector on the information side of things, which is very important. But there is not really a way to capture the decide phase in an executive fashion. So there is greater risk, in my view, in the execute phase. What that also means, though, the separation of decide and execute, is that we can take more liberties. We can explore more of the centralized to decentralized design space within the decide phase without creating significant capture risk. So we can do more kinds of delegation of decision making as long as we, as a DAO, as a network, retain the execution power. So I expect, and I'm really excited for in DAOs, being able to see an explosion, lots of experimentation of different types of ways that we can make decisions together. Maybe those are by consensus. Maybe those are more emergent. Maybe they're via quadratic voting. Maybe they're one person, one vote, or conviction voting, or 70 things that we've never even thought of before. And to me, that's really exciting. Okay, so the execute phase is where a lot of importance lies. So this is where we take the option that was decided upon, that was selected in the previous phase, and we put it into action. So this is really where the rubber meets the road. So like the driver decides and like, okay, I'm gonna go left, but where the rubber meets the road is where this tortured analogy ends. Actually, thankfully, that was maybe went down the wrong path with that one. There's actually two dimensions to the execute phase. Other phases have this centralized versus decentralized dimension. Execute has an additional dimension of autonomy versus dependence. So this is where a lot of what makes a DAO really comes from, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But if the power to execute, the executive power, so to speak, is concentrated, there is really high capture risk in that kind of organization, in that kind of network. So decentralizing executive power is crucial to resisting capture. And if we decentralize executive power, that means we are resisting capture by internal actors, internal agents. So members of a DAO find it very difficult as individuals to capture internal resources and make them useful for their own private benefit. It's only by the consent of the DAO as a whole that those resources can be used. On the other hand, autonomy is crucial to resisting external capture. If our organization, if actions that we take or actions that we are executing, if the actual execution of those actions is dependent upon some legal system to make them work, is dependent upon some other organization to make them happen, then that legal system or actors within it or that other organization can capture the resources that we have. So autonomy is crucial to resisting external capture. I'll make one other note here on concentrated executive power. If it's concentrated, if it's centralized, then it doesn't really matter how decentralized the decide phase was. If there's one person or two people who can basically completely ignore the decision that was made and take a different action, then the decide phase was basically completely powerless. Okay, evaluate phase, we'll wrap this up really quickly, but this is where we analyze the impact of the action that we took. There's not a ton of executive power expressed here, but there's some influence, some soft power that can be expressed here, especially if information is not open and accessible to everybody in the network. So that is where people can start to play political games or manipulation games with asymmetrical information, and that's where influence kind of comes into play, and that can pose some capture risks as well. Okay, so we've come all this way. There's many questions that we can ask with this framework. The first one that I wanted to ask, though, is what is a DAO actually? And trying to do this from a very minimalist, non-prescriptive first principles approach. So one way to think about it is that DAOs are the most capture-resistant form of governance that we have yet. We all know DAOs are not perfect, but they have a ton of promise in this area. So I have this, and this definition has been evolving, and the final bullet here I've actually added recently. But this is how I think about what a DAO is. And this is not the only definition, but this is the one that I feel is best for the way I think about things. So a DAO is a network of agents with common purpose, which means this is kind of where the idea of an organization comes from, the O in a DAO. So they're a network of agents with common purpose where the power to execute actions that manage shared resources is distributed among all agents or persons in the network. So that executive power is decentralized, and to no persons, no agents outside of the network. The execute phase is autonomous, in other words. And this is the new one, information about crucial operations of the DAO, of the network, is fully available to everybody in the network. So that's where I have landed recently, or over the last number of months, on how I think about what a DAO is. Something that does not fall within this definition, I would say, is not a DAO. That said, that's okay. There's lots of other types of organizations that are not DAOs that are still quite resistant to capture. Maybe not as resistant to capture as DAOs, but still in many ways better than more traditional organizations. Tokenized communities are sort of on the edge of what DAOs are a lot of times. There are organizations that are going through a process of progressive decentralization, aspiring DAOs, for example. They're not quite DAOs, but they're still pretty good. Okay, so that's basically the big question that I wanted to answer from, and where this framework came from in the first place. But there are other questions that we can ask ourselves and other questions we can answer. Do DAOs have to be permissionless? Maybe not. What are other forms of decentralized execution? Is accountability an important form of that? We can do some case studies. We can use this framework to describe other types of as yet to exist capture resistant organizations. We can even look at other things like benefits of capture resistance to the individuals in the network in terms of their own autonomy as contributors or other things like that. So if you're interested in these concepts and you want to talk about this, you want to get involved, one of the things that I have not made as much progress on as I would love some help on, is a wiki or knowledge graph, ideally hosted on something like Radical. I would love to do more writing with others about some of these concepts. And I've spun up a new Discord server for discussion about anti-capture things. It's pretty quiet right now, but it's a place, if you're interested, to come chat about anti-capture and anti-capture organizations. So that's all. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Spencer. That was a great recap. I think you touched on a lot of key points. Networks, agents, resources, and actions. I think those are like putting and enumerating different features that everyone kind of uses. And I think actually giving them names and describing them how you've done helps define what those are. So I think you did a great job of really distilling a lot of information in a way that is actionable. So even that going into the actions, and I think how you put that if the executive fails to meet the decisions and their duty, then it kind of is like a collapse of the entire structure. So I think you did a wonderful job of defining the power and the capture part. So thank you very much. I'm having a little issue with my camera right now, so it's not turning on. But it's wonderful to see you again, and thanks for the links. Make sure you drop them in the Discord as well.
Will do. Thanks so much, Penguin. Appreciate the fine words or the kind words, and for having me on. And it's great to join MetaFest again.
Thanks, Spencer.